Absolutely. So, we've been very blessed. We've had the same crew for 13 years. And so everybody I work with is very close to Frank.
Danielle Colby's life changed forever the moment Mike Wolf was sentenced for Frank Fritz's murder. The American Pickers office manager, who became known for her tattoos, vintage style, and no-nonsense attitude, now faced an impossible situation. Initially appearing as a reluctant witness for the prosecution, Colby had tried to maintain a neutral position throughout the investigation. But explosive new evidence has placed her at the center of the controversy that continues to rock the antique collecting world. Federal investigators announced yesterday that they are expanding their investigation to include Colby, after discovering a series of encrypted text messages between her and Wolf in the days surrounding Fritz's death. These messages, recovered from a backup server, paint a troubling picture of Colby's potential knowledge of events leading up to the murder. While she hasn't been charged with any crime, the pressure on the reality star has intensified as authorities dig deeper into the American Pickers operation that appears more sinister with each new revelation. Colby initially gained fan support for her emotional testimony during Wolf's trial, where she appeared visibly shaken while describing changes in his behavior. "I noticed Mike had become obsessed with being the sole face of American Pickers," she testified through tears. "When I asked him about reconciling with Frank, he became defensive and angry." Her testimony was considered crucial in securing Wolf's conviction, portraying him as increasingly controlling and paranoid about Fritz's potential return to television. However, digital forensics experts working for the FBI have uncovered evidence suggesting Colby may have known more than she revealed on the stand. According to court documents unsealed this morning, Colby exchanged over 200 messages with Wolf in the week before Fritz's death, with several discussing Fritz's medication schedule and when he would be alone at his residence. One particularly damning message, sent just hours before Fritz was found unresponsive, read, "He's alone now. Nobody's scheduled to check on him until tomorrow. Windows closing." Wolf's response, "It's handled. Delete this thread." These revelations have shocked fans who viewed Colby as one of the few authentic personalities on the show. Many had sympathized with her position as someone caught between the two feuding Pickers, never suspecting she might have been actively involved in the events that led to Fritz's death. Her attorney, Margaret Wilson, issued a brief statement this morning denying any wrongdoing. Ms. Colby has cooperated fully with authorities from the beginning of this tragic case. The messages in question have been taken completely out of context and do not indicate any knowledge of or participation in criminal activity. The investigation into Colby's involvement began when investigators re-examined security footage from Fritz's neighborhood. While Wolf's vehicle was clearly identified arriving at the residence on the night of Fritz's death, enhanced analysis of the footage revealed a passenger in the vehicle who remained in the car while Wolf entered the house. Facial recognition software, though inconclusive due to the footage quality, suggested the passenger could have been Colby. When questioned about this during Wolf's trial, Colby had denied being present at Fritz's home the night of his death. Further raising suspicions, financial records show that Colby received a wire transfer of $175,000 from one of Wolf's shell companies 2 days after Fritz's death. The transfer was labeled as a business consultation fee, but investigators have found no evidence of any legitimate consulting work. Additionally, Colby purchased a property in Puerto Rico, where she has spent increasing amounts of time, just weeks after this payment. Prosecutors are investigating whether this could have been payment for her silence or assistance. The relationship between Colby and Wolf appears to have been far more complex than the professional friendship portrayed on television. Former crew members have come forward describing instances where the two would have intense private conversations that would immediately stop when others entered the room. One production assistant, speaking on condition of anonymity, described witnessing Colby and Wolf arguing heatedly about Fritz in the months before his departure from the show. She was telling Mike that Frank was becoming a liability, that the show would be better without him, the assistant recalled. "When I walked in, they both went silent and acted like nothing was happening." Perhaps most disturbing are the newly discovered journal entries from Fritz himself, found in a storage unit he maintained separate from his main residence. In entries dated just weeks before his death, Fritz expressed growing paranoia about both Wolf and Colby. "D and M are always whispering. When I'm around," he wrote, "I've caught them looking through my medication more than once, claiming they're just making sure I'm taking it right. Something feels off. I don't trust either of them anymore." This journal directly contradicts statements Colby made during Wolf's trial, where she claimed Fritz trusted her completely and often confided in her about his deteriorating relationship with Wolf. Prosecutors are now reviewing her testimony for potential perjury charges, as multiple entries in Fritz's journal suggest he had come to view Colby as firmly aligned with Wolf against him. The History Channel, still reeling from the scandal surrounding Wolf's conviction, issued a statement distancing themselves from Colby. In light of these disturbing allegations, we have suspended all professional relationships with Ms. Colby pending the outcome of the investigation. The network remains committed to cooperating fully with authorities as they continue to uncover the full truth surrounding these tragic events. Colby's rapid rise to fame through American Pickers had already taken an unusual path. Initially hired to manage Wolf's antique shop, Antique Archaeology, she quickly became a fan favorite and increasingly prominent on the show. After Fritz's departure, she took on a larger role, often accompanying Wolf on picking trips. Investigators are now examining whether her expanded role and financial compensation were connected to her potential involvement in the conspiracy against Fritz. Former friends of Colby have expressed shock at the allegations. "This isn't the Danielle I thought I knew," said Aaron Murphy, who worked alongside Colby at Antique Archaeology for several years. But looking back, there were times when she and Mike would be intensely focused on private conversations, and she became increasingly secretive about certain aspects of the business. It was like there were parts of her life she kept completely separate. Colby's public image had always been that of an independent, strong-minded woman who maintained her own identity while working within the traditionally male-dominated world of antique collecting. She balanced her role on American Pickers with burlesque dancing, clothing design, and various other creative pursuits. This multifaceted persona made her relatable to fans who saw her as authentically herself in an industry often criticized for manufactured drama. The investigation has also revealed questionable practices within the American Pickers operation that went far beyond what viewers saw on television. Financial records indicate that Colby managed several offshore accounts where profits from particularly valuable items were directed, potentially to avoid taxation. These accounts, set up under shell companies with names like Vintage Solutions LLC and Rusty Gold Enterprises, received millions in deposits over the years, with withdrawals often coinciding with major purchases by both Colby and Wolf. Forensic accountants working with the FBI have traced approximately $3.2 million flowing through these accounts in the 5 years preceding Fritz's death. Of particular interest to investigators is a series of withdrawals totaling $450,000 in the months before Fritz died, money that has not been accounted for in any legitimate business expenses. When questioned about these accounts during Wolf's trial, Colby claimed to have only minimal knowledge of the show's financial operations, a statement contradicted by newly discovered documents bearing her signature as an authorized account manager. Legal experts following the case suggest that Colby could face charges ranging from accessory to murder, to obstruction of justice and financial crimes, depending on what the expanded investigation reveals. Former federal prosecutor James Harrington, who has been following the case closely, noted that the text messages alone create serious legal jeopardy for Colby. If prosecutors can prove she knew what Wolf was planning and provided any assistance or failed to report it, she could be facing significant prison time. The fallout has extended beyond the legal realm, with Colby's various business ventures suffering immediate consequences. Her online vintage clothing store has seen orders plummet, and several scheduled appearances at burlesque events have been canceled. Her social media accounts, once filled with vintage fashion and behind-the-scenes glimpses of her life, have gone silent since the new allegations emerged. Perhaps most telling is Wolf's reaction to the investigation expanding to include Colby. When informed during a prison interview that she was now under scrutiny, witnesses described him smiling for the first time since his conviction. "About time," he reportedly said. "She knew everything. Ask her about the storage unit in Davenport. Ask her what we found in Frank's journal." Prison officials terminated the interview at that point. Fritz's sister Lisa, who has remained largely out of the public eye throughout the ordeal, issued a brief statement through her attorney. "Our family has suspected from the beginning that more than one person was involved in Frank's death. We trust the authorities to uncover the full truth, no matter how painful that might be. Frank deserves justice, and that means holding everyone accountable for their actions, regardless of their public image. Former crew members have described a work environment that became increasingly tense and secretive in the years leading up to Fritz's departure and subsequent death. "There was always this sense that there were two versions of American Pickers," said former camera operator Jason Miller. "There was the folksy, treasure-hunting show that viewers saw, and then there was this whole other operation happening behind the scenes. Danielle was always at the center of that second world, managing information and controlling who had access to Mike." Miller described witnessing Colby removing pages from Fritz's personal notebook when he left it unattended during filming, an incident he didn't think much of at the time, but now views in a more sinister light. She said she was just keeping track of items he was interested in so they wouldn't bid against each other, but he was really upset when he noticed pages missing. The investigation has also raised questions about the authenticity of the show itself. Documents recovered from Wolf's office after his arrest revealed that many of the pics featured on the show were pre-arranged, with Colby coordinating with property owners weeks in advance to stage discoveries. In some cases, valuable items were planted at locations to create more dramatic television, with Colby handling the financial arrangements to compensate owners for participating in what amounted to elaborate staging. While such practices aren't uncommon in reality television, they contradict the authentic, spontaneous image American Pickers cultivated over its run. The small cemetery outside LeClaire, Iowa, had never seen so many vehicles parked along its narrow gravel paths. Television crews, antique collectors, and curious onlookers gathered behind hastily erected barricades as a team of specialists prepared to open the granite tomb of Frank Fritz, the beloved American Pickers star who had passed away 1 year earlier. What was meant to be a simple relocation required by local land development had turned into a media spectacle, but no one could have predicted what waited inside. Discoveries that would send ripples through both the antiquing world and beyond. The decision to relocate Fritz's resting place came after the small cemetery had been purchased by developers planning to expand a nearby historical museum. Ironically, the kind of place Fritz himself might have visited in search of treasures during his picking days. The Fritz family had reluctantly agreed to the move, requesting privacy during what they expected to be a straightforward transfer to a more permanent location at a larger memorial garden 20 miles away. But when word leaked to local media about the planned relocation, interest exploded beyond anyone's expectations. Local officials, overwhelmed by public interest, eventually agreed to allow a limited media presence, with proceeds from filming rights going to the Crohn's Disease Foundation, honoring the condition Fritz had battled throughout his adult life. The Fritz family, though initially hesitant, ultimately supported the decision, believing Frank himself might have appreciated the funds going to help others with his condition. His sister Lisa told reporters, "Frank never wanted a fuss, but he always wanted to help people. This way, he still can." The morning of the relocation dawned clear and cool. Cemetery workers had prepared the site the previous day, clearing pathways for equipment and establishing a perimeter that would allow the specialists to work without interference. Dr. Eleanor Chambers, a respected archaeological conservator with experience handling historical artifacts, had been brought in to oversee the process. Her expertise with delicate historical items made her the perfect choice to ensure everything was handled with appropriate care and respect. "In these situations, our primary concern is dignity," Dr. Chambers explained to the small group of approved media representatives. "We're treating this with the same protocols we would use for any historical relocation, with additional considerations for the family's wishes." What she didn't mention was the unusual nature of Fritz's burial, details that had been kept private at the family's request until now. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the work began. The heavy granite top of the tomb was carefully lifted by a small crane, revealing not a traditional casket, but a specially designed preservation chamber. According to Mike Wolf, Fritz's longtime picking partner, who watched from a respectful distance, this had been in accordance with Fritz's own unusual wishes. "Frank always joked that when he died he wanted to be surrounded by his favorite picks," Wolf later explained. "We all thought he was kidding, but after his stroke in 2022, he got his affairs in order and made his wishes very clear. He had this special chamber designed that would preserve both him and a selection of his most treasured finds." As the conservation team opened the sealed inner chamber, Gasps echoed across the silent cemetery. Inside, surrounding Fritz's casket in specially designed compartments, was one of the most remarkable private collections of Americana ever assembled. Items that even his closest friends had never seen. Each piece had been carefully chosen by Fritz himself during his final years, creating what amounted to a personal museum of American history. Dr. Chambers, though experienced with historical artifacts, appeared visibly moved. "In my 20 years of conservation work, I've never seen anything like this," she told the assembled press. "This isn't just a collection. It's a deeply personal historical narrative." The most striking item positioned near Fritz's head was a pristine 1934 Indian motorcycle with original paint and documentation linking it to its first owner, a Midwest mail carrier who had used it on rural routes. Fritz had discovered the motorcycle hidden in an Iowa barn in 2019, but had never revealed it publicly. Motorcycle experts on site estimated its value at over $300,000, but its historical significance was priceless. Nearby sat a weathered wooden box containing what appeared to be personal letters from Thomas Edison to a young female inventor whose ideas had allegedly contributed to some of his patents. The correspondence, never before seen by historians, suggested a collaborative relationship that could potentially rewrite portions of America's innovation history. Historical document experts would later confirm their authenticity, creating a sensation in academic circles. Perhaps most touching was a collection of handcrafted toy cars, each one tagged with the name of a child from the Iowa Children's Hospital, where Fritz had quietly volunteered during his final years. According to hospital staff who later came forward, Fritz had taught a workshop for young patients, helping them create miniature versions of classic vehicles as part of their therapy. He had kept one from each child who had participated, a private reminder of the connections he had formed away from the cameras. But the item that created the biggest stir sat in a custom-built glass case at the foot of the casket. A small, leather-bound journal with the words, "The Real Finds," embossed on its cover. Inside, Fritz had documented not the items featured on American Pickers, but the human stories behind them. Detailed accounts of the families, artisans, and everyday Americans whose possessions had passed through his hands. The journal revealed a depth to Fritz's work that even longtime viewers hadn't fully appreciated, showing how he had served as an unofficial historian of ordinary American lives. Frank wasn't just collecting stuff. He was preserving stories, Mike Wolf said, emotion evident in his voice as he flipped carefully through the journal's pages. "This book is the real treasure here. It's Frank telling us what mattered most to him all along." As news of the discoveries spread beyond the cemetery, social media exploded with reactions. Trending hashtags reflected both amazement at the collection and deeper appreciation for the man himself. Antiquing groups organized memorial picking events, with proceeds going to historical preservation societies. The History Channel announced a special documentary, Fritz's Final Collection, with Wolf serving as host and narrator. Perhaps most significantly, several major museums expressed interest in exhibiting the collection as a unified whole. The Smithsonian Institution proposed a traveling exhibition titled American Picker, the Personal Collection of Frank Fritz, which would tour the same small towns and rural communities Fritz had visited during his picking career. "These items belong together, and they belong with the people Frank connected with," said Smithsonian curator Robert Hensley. "This isn't just about the monetary value, which is substantial, but about the cultural tapestry these objects represent together." The Fritz family, after careful consideration, agreed to the exhibition concept, with the stipulation that the collection would ultimately be housed in a permanent museum in Fritz's hometown. Lisa Fritz explained their decision. "Frank spent his life bringing forgotten treasures back into the light. Now these pieces can continue telling the stories he valued so much." Conservation experts worked for 3 days cataloging and carefully removing each item from the chamber, documenting original positioning and any accompanying notes Fritz had included. The process was streamed live on several platforms, with historical experts providing context and appraisals as each new item emerged. Viewership numbers broke records for historical content, with people tuning in from around the world. Beyond the historical significance, the experience revealed a side of Fritz that even his longtime fans hadn't fully grasped. The man who had spent decades uncovering America's forgotten treasures had, in his final act, transformed himself into one of the greatest collections of all. A curated exhibition that represented not just value, but the values he had championed throughout his life. The relocation itself, once the collection had been safely removed, proceeded with quiet dignity. Fritz's casket was transferred to its new resting place, accompanied by a small procession of vintage vehicles driven by fellow collectors and friends. His new memorial, designed with input from Wolf and the Fritz family, incorporated elements of America's roadside architecture, a fitting tribute to a man who had spent his life traveling the back roads in search of history. In the weeks following the relocation, attendance at small historical societies and rural museums surged nationwide, dubbed the Fritz Effect by cultural commentators. People who had never previously shown interest in historical preservation began exploring their own community's stories, inspired by the Pickers' final collection. The journal, carefully preserved and digitized, became the foundation for a new historical initiative focusing on ordinary Americans and their contributions to the country's development. The Fritz Fellowship was established to support researchers documenting the stories of everyday objects and their creators, particularly in rural and overlooked communities. 1 year after his passing, Frank Fritz, the man who had spent his life rescuing forgotten pieces of Americana from obscurity, had managed to create perhaps his most significant impact yet. The collection he assembled in his final years didn't just preserve historical objects. It transformed how many people viewed the value of everyday history and the stories embedded in the items Americans create, use, and pass down through generations. As Mike Wolf observed during the closing moments of the documentary that would later win an Emmy Award, Frank always said the best picks were the ones with the best stories. With this final collection, he told his own story better than anyone else could have, and reminded us all why these pieces of the past matter so much to our future.
Absolutely. So, we've been very blessed. We've had the same crew for 13 years. And so everybody I work with was very close to Frank.
The antique collecting community was still mourning the loss of one of its most recognizable faces, when reports of FBI involvement sent shockwaves through Frank Fritz's grieving family. What began as a personal tragedy quickly evolved into something far more complex as federal investigators stepped in, bringing questions nobody was prepared to answer. Frank Fritz had spent years bringing America's forgotten treasures back into the spotlight on History Channel's hit show, American Pickers. But now his own story had taken an unexpected turn that left his loved ones trembling with uncertainty. Frank Fritz had become a household name through his work alongside Mike Wolf. For over a decade, viewers followed their adventures across America's backroads as they transformed dusty barns and cluttered garages into treasure hunts, uncovering pieces of American history that had been forgotten by time. Fritz's knowledge of vintage toys, automobiles, and oil cans made him a beloved expert among collectors and casual viewers alike. His down-to-earth personality and genuine enthusiasm for preservation resonated with millions who tuned in each week. Behind the scenes, however, Fritz's life took several difficult turns. His departure from the show in 2020 marked the beginning of a series of personal challenges. Health issues became increasingly problematic, including a struggle with Crohn's disease that had plagued him for years. Then came the devastating stroke in 2022 that removed him from public life almost entirely. When news broke of his passing on September 30th, 2024, at age 60, fans worldwide